Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive review of the Powkiddy X55. Full disclosure, this device was sent to me for review by a company called litnxt.com. I've purchased multiple devices from them throughout the time that I've been doing YouTube, and they've sent me a lot of different devices for review now. So highly suggest them, check them out if you like. I have a link in my description, and they have a 15% off promotion going on right now. Might be of assistance to you if you're checking out any of these devices, including the one that I'm going to be talking about today. Let's jump right in. The X55 has two color options. There's a blue that I have here, and then there's a black version. And the MSRP of both of these devices is about $110 US, although it's regularly on sale for about $85 to $90, depending on if you're using Powkiddy's coupons or how you're getting it. But through their direct site, it's about $90, let's say, US. The price of this is important, as it's going to come up a little bit later on, so just keep that in mind as we talk through all of the things that this device can do. Looking at the specs of this device, and we have the RK3566 chip, which you don't need to memorize, but it's something we've seen for the last year, and I'm extremely familiar with at this point. This chip will essentially top out at some Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PlayStation Portable. And I use some as a very loose word. We'll talk about that later. In case it's not coming through, this thing is big as well. Much bigger than any of the other 3566 devices that we have, like the Powkiddy RK2023 or the Anbernic RG353PS. Traditionally, I'm not a fan of larger devices, especially if they're underpowered like this is. For me, the moment it stops being portable or pocketable, I would rather pull out something like the ROG Ally or the Steam Deck or the GPD Win 4 or something along those lines. Even the Logitech G Cloud is a better option at that point. The key specs to point out with this device is the massive 5.5-inch 720p screen, which does look great, although it's dim. It has Wi-Fi, so thank you, Linux only, 2 gigs of RAM, and it has HDMI out. The screen is a weird one, as it's a 16:9 aspect ratio, and this device really doesn't play 16:9 content well. Unless you're talking about game streaming like Moonlight, which a $5 Raspberry Pi can do, so it's not something to really praise in this device. I'm not exactly sure what the reason for doing the aspect ratio on this device is, especially with this chip. I think it would have made more sense if it was a T618 device, which is the chip used in the Anbernic RG405M and the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Because then at least you could play a lot more PSP than what this device does currently. It would just make more sense. Lastly, the battery is a 4000 mAh battery, which translates to about 4-ish hours in battery life, but it takes an astonishingly long 2 hours to charge. It's definitely the lowest in battery life compared to the RK2023 and the RG353PS, which this device competes with, among others. And it's definitely the lowest in battery life out of all of my handhelds that I own. At least I'm pretty sure it is. First impressions right out of the gate, and it actually feels and looks pretty well made. Surprisingly well made for a Powkiddy device. There's a nice big D-pad, buttons feel pretty good, comfortable to hold, and all is well. Taking a tour, and let's start with the top. Which, it's an awesome feature, but it actually stands up on its own. Not sure if that was intentional or not, but I like it. We have stacked triggers, which we'll get back to, but if you saw my intro, you know. Reset button, headphone jack, OTG and DC port, mini HDMI port, a host port, and a power button. The actual charging port for this device is that DC/OTG port. Then on the bottom, we have 2 SD card slots, one for the operating system and one for ROMs. Or you can use the operating system slot for both, and that's the one labeled TF1. Now, if you're doing mental math, we're missing the volume buttons. And those are right there on the front of the device. It's right next to Start and Select, and they did it a bit weird, where there's one on each side. Surprisingly, I don't hate the placement. but let's just jump right in. Why in the world is everything so loud on this device? You heard my intro, so let's start with the triggers, and yeah, there's almost zero chance I'm going to be happy playing any game that uses the triggers heavily. But okay, it's just the triggers, right? Everything else is fine? Well, unless you want to push start, select, or raise or lower the volume. Let me just lower my volume with a machine gun. I'm convinced a lot of these companies don't actually use the devices they make, and for Powkiddy especially, since all of these devices feel like they were made by a different company, I could see it. I mean, look at the RK2023 and the X55 together. There's basically zero similarities here and no real consistency. It's kind of weird. Thankfully, the face buttons, analog sticks, and D-pad are a lot more muted in sound and normal with other devices. But anyway, continuing on, and we have the normal Switch style analog sticks, which are fine, but people will complain that the left one is in the wrong spot. And then we have the D-pad, which I love that it's big, but don't like that it's a little bit stiff. Trying my Pokemon test here, and it doesn't pass. You can move the character in any direction for the left and right D-pad buttons. So false diagonals are likely to be a concern here. It's also weirdly sharp on the side of it, and just could have used a bit more sanding down, but these are just nitpicks. As far as the other buttons go, they're fine, except my A button doesn't work half the time. I was able to capture it on camera multiple times, as you can see. I routinely have to push it twice just to get it to register, and that's sort of frustrating. I don't know if that's an issue amongst all of these or just mine, but otherwise when it works, it's just fine. I just wished it would work 100% of the time, like it should. The device itself is pretty comfortable to hold and for long periods of time. It has some really good ergonomics to it, which I especially like. Let's do some size comparisons, and I'm going to start off with what I consider to be this device's biggest competitor, and that's the Anbernic RG353 PS, which is currently one of my favorite devices. The PS is much more compact, has a smaller D-pad but slightly larger face buttons as well. It has a much smaller screen, and it's a 4:3 aspect ratio that's more in line with the content it can actually play. Both devices have the same performance though. Then we have the Powkiddy RK2023, and it basically fits right inside the X55 screen. It's really compact. Much larger face buttons here, smaller and worse D-pad, but again, same performance. All three of these devices have the exact same performance. I have reviews up for both of these other devices if that interests you a bit more. Pulling out a larger device, and here's the Logitech G Cloud. And it's sort of a more compact and smaller G Cloud in size. And the G Cloud has a fantastic screen as well. I'd say it's a lot better than the X55, but they're in different weight classes. And just to give you a frame of reference for devices that people might actually own at home, here's the new 3DS, which, yeah, fits into the screen when it's closed, and hopefully that just gives you an idea of the size of this device. So the screen is the obvious standout here. It's nice, but not without its drawbacks. As I mentioned before, this is a 720p screen for a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is perfect for PSP and game streaming like Moonlight for modern games. The problem is it doesn't play PSP that well, and that's really the only content that would use this type of screen. On a brightness scale though, it lags behind other devices quite significantly. It's a lot more dim than the RG353 PS, the RK2023, RG405M, and the G Cloud. Overall, despite it being a 720p screen, to my eyes, it really isn't better than the other options available. I prefer a much brighter screen, which this isn't. Audio-wise, and for the speakers being on the bottom of the device, it sounds pretty good. There's no concerns or issues with the device on the highest volume, and it sounds as it should, which is a definite positive here. Let's have a quick listen. I'm not going to spend long at all on software. This device runs a custom firmware called Gelos. Gelos, quoting from their Discord, is not an end user focused product. And so if you have any issues with Gelos, it's up to you to solve them. They'll do their best to help you, but through their own rules and through their own statement, it's really on you, as they're a developer focused operating system. It's a confusing statement, as this is actually an operating system that is shipping with the device, so it really is an end user operating system that deserves to have end user support. Not sure why they're doing that, but that's on them. As far as what the operating system can do, you can launch games, set up your Wi-Fi, change different game collections, and do all of the normal things that you would expect with an operating system. Let's move on. I can't wait to escape showing this chipset and the games it runs. For me, this device stops at PlayStation 1, and that's what you can comfortably play up to without any tinkering. However, if you're someone that likes to get into the weeds with your device, change settings, emulators, and all of that, you can get some of the catalog of Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP to play. Nothing higher than that, the chip isn't strong enough. The actual number of playable N64, Dreamcast, and PSP games isn't something that I could actually tell you, but I would argue it's less on the good side than you'd want. And it's why I don't consider those consoles as a great experience for this device. So just going back to the start and our talk about the device's aspect ratio, you can start to see my confusion at the choice here. I've had older consoles playing throughout, and arcade, Game Boys, NES, SNES, Genesis, and they'll all play just fine, as long as you don't mind the black bars on the side. So as we move into PlayStation 1, it's the same scenario, but I wanted to show this as these consoles would be the reason I would purchase this device. Essentially, if you just wanted a larger screen for them in a lightweight handheld, this would work. It all depends on if you value the 720p screen over having something more smaller and more compact and brighter. And now, because I have to show it, let's talk about Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP, so you can understand what I mean when I say some of those systems. There's two camps here. Either you're a tinkerer and you like digging through every setting, every combination of emulators and cores and playing with all of them for every single game, or you just want things to work out of the box. Going by a lot of my YouTube comments, you definitely want things to work out of the box. This is definitely not an everything works out of the box scenario for these platforms. So for Nintendo 64, I can boot up and play something like Super Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time if I could actually get it to work, and it'll play decently fine with only minor issues throughout. And this only requires a simple emulator change. But the moment you jump into a tougher to emulate game, Mario Tennis, Cruisin' USA, something along those lines, no combination of changing emulators, settings, or anything will get it to what I call playable state. It just won't. So that gives you the range. I will say that with some minor tweaks, you could likely get a lot of Nintendo 64 playing, especially if you don't mind dropping the resolution to 240p. But if this isn't your only handheld and you have something more powerful, why bother? But if you like tinkering and dealing with crashes and changing emulators and settings and all of that, then go right ahead, see what works for you. And it's the same idea for both Dreamcast and PSP. On the Dreamcast side, some games will run just fine, and then others just won't. And we talked about it earlier, but the dim screen really hurts in dark scenes like the one in Legacy of Kain. In actuality, for most 3D games that have a dark scene, the dim screen isn't going to do well. I really can't see a single thing that's going on in this game, and this isn't very fun. But now we're at PSP, which should be perfect for this device given the aspect ratio. but it just isn't. This isn't a good PSP chip, nor the device for it, despite the screen. It just goes back to what I said about Nintendo 64. And you're adding frame skip here, and you're changing the resolution to 1x or 2x instead of auto, as well as every other emulator hack you can find, plus more tweaking, and now you're barely playing the game, you're just spending time trying to deal with technical aspects of it and getting things to work. As someone who has a core audience of people that are just looking to get into the hobby easily, or looking for their very first device, that's not the ideal experience for you. Plus, for some reason, none of my PSP games had any audio, but I'm just going to chalk that up to a settings thing as I was fiddling around with things. I want to spend a bit more time on the wrap up, as I think it's important and more important than everything else I've said today. Here's the thing. Prior to the release of the Retroid Pocket 2S, which we're going to talk about right now, the Powkiddy X55 still didn't make sense to me. The RK2023 and the RG353PS, both of which have the same chip and performance, are pocketable handhelds that have the aspect ratio that suits the content that they can play. They're both much better devices than the X55. The X55, however, is large and not pocketable or really portable in any sense. And the aspect ratio doesn't fit the content of what it can play. I don't know who would be the actual target audience for this, besides somebody who just really wanted a larger screen, but not a better screen, and no performance boost to go with it. But now we have the Retroid Pocket 2S. It's $10 US more than the X55, so it's $99 US plus shipping. And spec-wise, it's not even close. It'll easily do Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, as well as some GameCube, Wii, and PS2. And again, some is used loosely here. Don't buy it for those systems. But similar to the Nintendo 64 on the X55, some things are playable. It has the D-pad up top for you purists out there, but it also has Hall sticks, a 4:3 aspect ratio, 480p screen, more RAM, analog triggers, much better battery life, and an operating system you can get support with in Android. Retroid's Android build is fantastic, and not something you need to worry about anyway. For $10 more, legitimately and truly, I don't know why anyone would buy an X55 in comparison. But that thought is also starting to apply to the RK2023 and the RG353PS as well. And remember, I love the RG353PS and consider it one of my favorite devices right now. I might actually argue that it applies to the RG405M as well. The Retroid Pocket 2S just came in and wiped everything else away, and with it goes the Powkiddy X55. So final thoughts here in a nice little list. For the positives, the screen on the X55 is larger and 720p. It's comfortable to hold, which is a good plus for me, and it's well made and feels good. Lastly, it has Wi-Fi, which is a huge plus to me as well. For the negatives, while the screen is larger, it's not as bright or as nice looking as other options. The device is also now priced out, as the Retroid Pocket 2S at $10 more is just better in every way. The aspect ratio of the device just doesn't fit what it actually runs. Gelos is not an end-user operating system, and the lack of support for it is a negative to any newcomer to this scene. The buttons are way too loud, just insanely loud. Lastly, it just feels like a device that was made for a better chip, or at least it should have been. This would have been an entirely different review if it had the T618 chip in it instead. I'm going to end it here. I hope this review was useful to you. Let me know in the comments below. What do you think? Is this device on your radar at all? Did I miss something that was completely obvious that would make this device a lot better? Because to me, I just don't see it. Let me know in the comments what you think. Please don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow, and hope you all have a good one.